The evening sun bled across the Arizona horizon, painting the plains in long streaks of amber and crimson. Dust swirled behind Caleb Rourke's horse as he rode the last mile toward his ranch. The old man had seen his share of hard days, drought, loneliness, and a war that left him with more ghosts than memories. The world had a way of forgetting men like him, but that evening the world was about to remind him that the past never truly rests. As he neared the creek that marked the edge of his land, something unusual caught his eye, a shape lying motionless among the reeds. At first he thought it might have been a stray calf or a deer brought down by a mountain lion, but when his horse snorted uneasily, he felt a ripple of unease. Caleb dismounted slowly, one hand resting on his revolver, and approached. The figure was human, a woman. Her dress, once white, was now a torn and muddy gray. Her hair, tangled and matted with dirt, hid most of her face. She was barefoot, her feet bruised and bleeding as though she'd run for miles. Caleb knelt beside her, calling out softly, "Ma'am, you hear me?" For a moment, there was nothing but the soft gurgle of the creek and the sighing wind. Then her lips moved. Her voice was barely a whisper, dry and cracked. "Don't send me back." Caleb froze. He could see now that her wrists were raw, ringed with deep cuts as if she'd torn herself free from ropes or shackles. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't something small. He lifted her gently, feeling the tremor of her breathing against his chest. She was light, too light, and cold despite the desert heat. He laid her across his horse and rode hard for home, his mind racing faster than the pounding hooves. By the time he reached the ranch, the lamps inside were already lit. Martha, his housekeeper and oldest friend, opened the door, her gray hair tied back and her apron dusted with flour. "Lord Almighty, Caleb," she gasped when she saw the woman. "What have you found this time?" "Trouble, I reckon," Caleb said, carrying the stranger inside and laying her on the couch. Martha fetched water and clean cloths while Caleb tried to coax some life back into the girl. Her skin was bruised in places that spoke of hands, cruel hands. A welt across her shoulder caught the firelight, and Caleb looked away, jaw tight. When Martha dabbed the woman's face, her eyes fluttered open for a moment, wide, fearful, a trapped animal's stare. "You're safe," Martha said gently. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you here?" The woman didn't answer. She tried to sit up but winced in pain. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and when Caleb reached out to steady her, she recoiled violently, pressing herself into the corner of the couch. "I won't hurt you," he murmured, stepping back. "Name's Caleb Rourke. This here's my ranch." Her lips moved again, but no sound came out. Then, slowly, she seemed to relax. Not fully, but enough to close her eyes. As the night deepened, Caleb stood by the window, watching the wind stir the dry grass. He couldn't shake her words. "Don't send me back." Who was she? And what kind of hell was she running from? Outside, a coyote howled, lonely and sharp. Caleb thought of all the empty nights since his wife had passed, nights filled with silence and work, and the endless ache of regret. Maybe, he thought, this woman wasn't the only one running from something. When he finally turned from the window, Martha had covered the stranger with a quilt. "She'll need time," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "She can have as much as she needs." But even as he said it, he knew trouble had found him, and that whatever storm this girl carried inside her, it was already on its way to his door. Morning came slow and heavy over the Rourke ranch, the golden light creeping through the wooden shutters like hesitant fingers. Caleb was already up, the smell of coffee and wood smoke filling the air as he stepped out onto the porch. The world was quiet, too quiet, save for the occasional cluck of hens and the soft groan of the windmill. Inside the house, he could hear Martha moving about, tending to the stranger they'd taken in. He didn't know her name yet. She hadn't said a word since the night before, though she'd murmured something in her sleep, words he couldn't make out. Caleb tried not to think about it too much, but truth was, he'd been thinking about little else. When he went back inside, he found Martha at the kitchen table, rolling bandages. "She's awake," she said without looking up. "Won't eat much, but she's drinking water." "That's something," Caleb nodded and poured himself another cup. She say anything? Just thank you. Martha's voice softened. And that she's sorry for causing trouble. Caleb frowned. Trouble ain't her fault. Martha gave him a knowing look. Maybe not, but I reckon she's been made to think it is. He hesitated at the hallway door. Mind if I... Martha smiled faintly. Go on. Just don't startle her none. Caleb stepped into the small bedroom. The woman sat by the window, wrapped in one of Martha's old quilts. Her hair, now brushed and clean, shimmered like chestnut in the sunlight. But her eyes, wide, gray, and haunted, still carried the wild fear of someone who had seen too much. She looked up as he entered, her body tensing like a cornered doe. Caleb raised a hand slowly. Easy now. Just came to check on you. She nodded slightly but said nothing. Her hands trembled in her lap. The silence stretched thin between them until she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. You should have left me there. Couldn't do that, Caleb replied. Wasn't raised that way. Her gaze fell to the floor. People who help me end up hurt. Caleb felt a chill. Ain't the first time you've run, is it? She didn't answer, but the way her shoulders stiffened told him enough. He decided not to push her further. You'll be safe here, he said, turning toward the door. But before he could leave, he heard a sharp intake of breath, a cry stifled behind clenched teeth. He turned back. She'd tried to stand and stumbled, clutching her side. Blood had seeped through the bandages Martha had wrapped the night before. Caleb called for Martha, and together they helped her back to bed. Hold her still, Martha said, fetching fresh cloths and a basin of warm water. Caleb knelt by the bedside, his hands gentle but firm. The woman tried to pull away, whispering, Don't touch me, please. Martha hushed her softly. It's all right, dear. We're just fixing your wounds. When Martha peeled back the soiled fabric, Caleb saw the truth. Deep, angry welts across her ribs and shoulders, the skin raised and torn in places. Whip marks, dozens of them. He drew a sharp breath and turned away, jaw tightening. My God, Martha whispered. Who could do such a thing? The woman's eyes glistened with tears she didn't try to hide. He said I needed to remember who owned me. The room went silent. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes like bones. Caleb stared at the floor, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles went white. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. You don't belong to no man. She looked at him then, really looked, and something flickered behind her pain. A glimmer of trust, maybe, or hope, faint and fragile. Martha rewrapped the bandages and stepped out to fetch soup. Caleb stayed a moment longer, unsure what to say. As he turned to go, her voice stopped him again. It hurts, she whispered, touching her chest lightly. Inside, too. Caleb paused in the doorway, his throat tightening. He wanted to tell her he understood, that some wounds never healed clean, that the pain of the past lived like a ghost beneath the skin. But all he managed was a quiet nod. I know, he said softly, but pain don't get to have the last word. And as he left the room, he made himself a silent promise. Whoever had done this to her, whoever had carved those scars into her flesh and spirit, would one day learn what it meant to bleed too. The next morning dawned bright and cold, the kind of morning that made the desert look almost pure, as if yesterday's pain could be buried beneath the new light. But inside Caleb Rourke's ranch house, the air felt heavier than ever. The stranger, the young woman with eyes like storm clouds, was beginning to heal, but she still avoided everyone. She moved quietly through the house, flinching at the creak of the floorboards, jumping at the bark of a dog. Caleb had seen wild horses act the same way after being broken, cautious, restless, waiting for the next blow to fall. Martha kept an eye on her, bringing her tea and talking softly about nothing in particular. Caleb mostly stayed out of the way. He figured the girl didn't trust men, and truth be told, he didn't blame her. But that afternoon, as Caleb mended the north fence line, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Hoof prints, fresh ones. 2 horses, maybe 3, had passed through the far edge of his property. He crouched to study the tracks. Whoever they weren't locals. The shoes were heavy, military style, not the kind ranch hands used. When he returned to the house, he found the woman, still pale, still silent, standing by the window watching the horizon. She must have seen something in his expression because she stiffened immediately. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaking. Caleb hesitated, but there was no point in lying. "Riders down by the creek." Looked like they were searching for something. Her face went white as bone. "They found me," Caleb frowned. "Who?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. She just stared at the floor, her hands trembling as if she were fighting some invisible memory. Finally, she whispered, "Colonel Bramley." Caleb blinked. "The cattle baron?" She nodded slowly. "He's not just that. He owns people too, though he doesn't call it that. He says we work off our debts, but nobody ever leaves his land alive." She looked up at him then, and Caleb saw something raw and unbearable in her eyes, the haunted reflection of cruelty he couldn't yet imagine. "My name's Lydia Harrow," she said quietly. "I worked for Bramley's ranch outside Prescott. I thought it was just cleaning, cooking, tending horses, but he had other plans." Her voice broke. "When one of the girls tried to escape, he made us all watch what he did to her." Caleb's stomach turned. He'd known Bramley for years, had even done business with him a few times. The man had money, power, and a polished tongue. No one in town ever questioned him. But now, hearing this, Caleb felt the slow burn of guilt crawl through his veins. He took off his hat and rubbed his temples. "Why come here? Why not head east, to the towns?" Lydia shook her head. "I tried. His men are everywhere. I thought if I could cross the river and reach the ranches near the border, I'd be safe. But they caught up to me near your land." Caleb's jaw tightened. "You saying they're still hunting you?" "They won't stop," she said. "He can't afford for anyone to talk." The silence that followed felt thick enough to choke on. Martha came in, sensing the tension. "Caleb," she said gently, "what are we going to do?" Caleb looked between them. The old woman who'd stood by him for years, and the broken girl who'd stumbled into his life like a wounded bird. He felt the weight of choice settle heavy on his shoulders. If he turned Lydia over to the sheriff, Bramley's men would take her within the hour. The law wouldn't lift a finger, not against a man with Bramley's influence. But if Caleb kept her hidden, he'd be risking his ranch, his livelihood, maybe his life. He stared out the window, toward the horizon where dust still hung in the air from those riders. Finally, he spoke. "You'll stay here. Ain't nobody taking you back there?" Lydia looked at him with disbelief, and something else flickered behind her tears. Relief. But Caleb wasn't fool enough to think it was over. As dusk settled over the plains, he checked his rifle, loaded every chamber, and bolted the door. Because he knew, deep down, that this was only the calm before a storm. And somewhere out there, Colonel Bramley was already tightening his grip, hunting for the one woman who dared to run from him. The night came in heavy and windless, the kind of silence that made every noise feel sharper. The lanterns flickered low inside Caleb Rourke's ranch house, casting long shadows across the walls. Lydia hadn't spoken much since telling her story. The weight of her past hung thick in the air. Caleb couldn't rest. He kept checking the windows, glancing toward the dark horizon, half expecting to see horsemen silhouetted against the moon. His instincts told him Bramley's men wouldn't stop searching. So before dawn, he saddled his horse and made plans. He decided to hide Lydia in the barn, where the hayloft could keep her out of sight. It wasn't much, but it was better than leaving her in the house where any knock at the door could give her away. When he told her his plan, she hesitated, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "They'll find me," she whispered. Caleb shook his head. "Not if I can help it. You just stay quiet. Martha'll bring you food. I'll handle the rest." He helped her into the barn while the sky was still dark. She climbed the ladder slowly, wincing from her injuries. Caleb made sure she had water, bread, and a lamp before leaving. For a moment, she looked down at him through the dim glow, her face half hidden in shadow. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Caleb paused, meeting her gaze. "Because someone should have helped sooner." Then he turned and left, his boots crunching on the dirt. By midday, the ranch looked calm again. Caleb hitched the wagon and rode into town to pick up supplies, mostly to keep up appearances. But something in his gut felt wrong. He noticed two strangers at the general store, clean boots, military posture, and eyes that swept the room like hawks. One of them had a scar on his jaw, the kind you get from a knife fight. When Caleb left the store, the men followed him out. One tipped his hat. "Morning, Mr. Rourke." "Fine day, ain't it?" Caleb nodded slowly. "Could be finer." "You boys lost?" "Not exactly," the man said. "We're looking for a runaway." "Young woman. About yay tall, brown hair, gray eyes. Might have passed through these parts." Caleb's heart thudded once hard, but his face stayed calm. "Ain't seen nobody like that." The man smiled, though his eyes stayed cold. "You sure?" "Colonel Bramley's offering a fine reward for her return." "I don't do business with Bramley," Caleb said flatly. "Never will again." The man's grin faded. "That's so? Shame. He speaks highly of you." Caleb mounted his horse. "Then he's a worse liar than I thought." He rode home slow, making sure he wasn't followed. By the time he reached the ranch, his nerves were raw. The barn door creaked softly when he pushed it open. Inside, Lydia was sitting in the hayloft, clutching a pistol that looked far too big for her trembling hands. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "They were here, weren't they?" He nodded grimly. "Riders, 2 of them. I sent 'em off, but they'll be back." Lydia's hands shook harder. "He'll kill you if he finds out you helped me." Caleb climbed up beside her. "He can try." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The smell of hay and oil hung thick in the air. Then, when Caleb noticed her shaking, he reached for the blanket beside her. But as he lifted it to cover her, something caught his eye. A mark, burned into her thigh just above the knee. He froze. The shape was unmistakable. A ranch brand, small but precise. The letter B inside a circle. Bramley's mark. Lydia's breath hitched as she realized what he'd seen. He said it was so I'd never forget who I belonged to. Caleb's chest felt tight. He'd seen cruelty before, on the battlefield among outlaws, but this was something darker. Something born from the kind of evil that thought itself righteous. He wrapped the blanket around her gently, careful not to meet her eyes. "You don't belong to him," he said, his voice low. "Not anymore," tears welled in her eyes, silent but relentless. Caleb looked away, jaw clenched, fury burning like wildfire beneath his calm. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over the desert. The storm was coming, not just the one in the sky, but the one riding straight for his ranch. Caleb didn't know how many men Bramley would send, or how much blood would be spilled before this was over. But as he left the barn that night and loaded his rifle, one truth settled deep in his bones. He wasn't just protecting a runaway anymore. He was standing between a monster and the only soul brave enough to escape him. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that always comes before something breaks. Caleb Rourke knew it. He could feel it in his bones, the same way an old war horse senses thunder before the storm. Bramley's men hadn't returned yet, but he knew they would. Men like Bramley didn't forgive, and they never forgot. Lydia stayed mostly in the barn, helping Martha with chores when she dared to leave. She moved like someone learning to walk again, cautious, uncertain, but determined. The shadows under her eyes had faded a little, though her nightmares hadn't. Sometimes Caleb could hear her cry out in the night, muffled sobs echoing through the wooden walls. He never went in when that happened. Some pain had to be carried alone until it was ready to be shared. One evening, Caleb found her outside, standing by the fence as the sun dipped low. She was watching the horizon, the same horizon she'd once run across, bleeding and terrified. Her hands were balled into fists. "Can't keep hiding forever," she said quietly without turning. Caleb stepped beside her. "Ain't asking you to. But we ain't rushing into a gunfight neither," she glanced at him. "If they come, I don't want to hide." "I want to fight." Her voice carried no fear, only anger, steady and deep. Caleb studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You ever held a gun before?" She shook her head. "Then we start at dawn." The next morning, Caleb brought out his old Colt .45, the same one he'd carried during his lawman days. The weapon had seen more sin than he liked to remember, but maybe now it could serve something right. He taught Lydia how to hold it, firm but not stiff, finger off the trigger until she was ready. At first, her hands trembled so badly the gun nearly slipped. "Breathe slow," Caleb said softly. "It ain't about strength. It's about calm," she tried again. The first shot went wide, the second hit the fence post. By the sixth, she hit the target square in the center. She blinked in surprise. Caleb grinned faintly. "Told ya. Ain't nothing to it but patience. They trained every day after that." Lydia learned to shoot, to saddle a horse, to clean a rifle. She grew stronger, in body and spirit. There were still moments when she'd flinch at sudden noises or lose herself to memories, but each time she recovered faster. Martha watched from the porch, pride softening her face. "You're making a fighter out of her," she told Caleb one evening. He shook his head. "She already was one. Just forgot for a while." By the end of the week, something like peace began to settle. For the first time, Lydia laughed. A quiet, uncertain sound, but it made Caleb's heart ache in a way he hadn't felt in years. He caught himself watching her too long sometimes, and each time he turned away, ashamed of the warmth that crept into his chest. That night, as the stars stretched endless across the desert sky, he told himself things might just turn out right. He was wrong. The fire came just before midnight. It started with the smell. Smoke. Faint at first, then thick and choking. Caleb burst out of bed, shouting for Martha. Flames were crawling up the side of the barn, orange and hungry. "Lydia!" he roared, grabbing his rifle. He ran through the smoke, coughing, eyes stinging. Inside the barn, horses screamed and thrashed. Lydia was there, struggling to free them, her face lit by the blaze. "Go!" she yelled. "Get out!" "Not without you!" Caleb grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door, but then he saw them through the smoke. 3 riders, silhouettes against the firelight. Bramley's men. Gunfire cracked. The world turned chaos. Caleb fired back, dropping one, but another struck him hard in the shoulder. He fell to one knee. Lydia screamed his name as rough hands seized her, dragging her away into the dark. He tried to rise, but his vision blurred. He could hear her shouting, struggling, and then silence. The hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the desert night. Caleb collapsed beside the burning barn, blood seeping into the dirt. The fire roared high into the sky, painting everything in a hellish glow. Through the smoke and pain, only one thought remained, clear, cold, and sharp as steel. I promised her she'd be safe. I failed her once. I won't again. And as the first light of dawn crept over the ashes, Caleb Rourke swore vengeance, not out of rage alone, but out of love, guilt, and the heavy weight of his word. The dawn after the fire rose red, the color of smoke, ash, and blood. The Rourke ranch lay in ruin. The barn was gone, the animals scattered, the earth still smoldering. Caleb stood in the wreckage, his shoulder wrapped in a strip of torn canvas, his face blackened by soot. He could barely breathe for the weight of it all. Lydia was gone. He replayed it in his mind, her scream, the riders dragging her into the darkness, the fire consuming everything behind them. He'd promised she'd be safe. He'd failed her. The guilt burned hotter than his wound. Martha found him standing in the ruins, his rifle slung over his good shoulder, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You can't go after them alone," she said softly. "I ain't got a choice," Caleb replied, voice like gravel. "They took her. They'll kill her if I wait." Martha stepped closer, holding a small flask of whiskey. "Drink that, you fool, before you fall off your horse." Caleb gave a faint, humorless smile. "If I fall, it'll be heading the right way." Before he mounted up, Martha grabbed his arm. "Caleb, that girl's been through hell. Don't let her see no more of it if you can help it." He nodded once, eyes hard. "I'll bring her back, Martha, or I won't come back at all." The trail was easy to follow. Fresh hoof prints, cigarette butts, and blood spots marking the way south through the desert. The sun climbed high, merciless and hot. Caleb rode for hours without rest, his horse snorting and sweating beneath him. By afternoon, he reached a bluff overlooking a dry ravine. From there, he could see them. Bramley's estate. A sprawling compound of adobe and timber surrounded by a tall fence and guarded by armed men. It was a fortress. The kind built by fear and blood money. Caleb tied his horse to a mesquite tree and crawled closer on foot. He spotted a woman's figure being led toward the stables, her brown hair tangled, her dress torn. Even from a distance, he knew it was Lydia. The sight hit him like a hammer. For a long moment, he couldn't move. Then something cold and focused took hold inside him. The part of him that once wore a badge. The part that knew how to end men who deserved it. He waited until nightfall. When the sun disappeared, he slipped down into the valley, silent as shadow. He moved between the outbuildings, every step measured, every breath steady. The smell of horses and oil filled the air. Somewhere inside the main house, laughter echoed, cruel and careless. In the stables, he found her. Lydia sat in the corner of a stall, her wrists bound again, her face bruised. She didn't see him at first, until he whispered, "Lydia." Her head shot up, disbelief written across her face. "Caleb? I thought—" He pressed a finger to his lips. "Quiet now." He cut her ropes, his hands shaking slightly. When she stood, she swayed, too weak to run. He caught her before she fell. "I told you I'd come," he whispered. Tears welled in her eyes. "He'll kill you. He said he'd make me watch." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He won't live that long." They slipped toward the barn door, but before they could reach it, a voice rang out behind them. "Well, ain't this a tender sight?" Colonel Bramley stepped from the shadows, gun in hand, his face a smirk twisted with cruelty. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and dressed in fine clothes that didn't hide the rot beneath. "I was wondering when you'd come play hero, Rourke." Caleb turned slowly, shielding Lydia behind him. "You took something that wasn't yours?" Bramley laughed. "Everything on my land's mine, Rourke." "Always has been," Caleb raised his rifle. "Not anymore." A shot cracked through the dark, and chaos erupted. Men came running, shouting. Horses screamed. Caleb fired twice, dropping 2 of Bramley's guards, then pulled Lydia toward the open gate. A bullet grazed his side, but he kept moving. Lydia stumbled, crying out, but he dragged her up, gritting through the pain. "Keep going!" he barked. They reached the fence just as more gunfire thundered behind them. Caleb turned, firing one last shot into the dark. The bullet hit Bramley's shoulder, spinning him backward. "You ain't getting far!" Bramley howled. "Watch me," Caleb growled. They rode into the desert, the moon their only witness. Lydia clung to him, weak but alive. When she finally spoke, her voice broke like glass. "I thought you wouldn't come." Caleb looked ahead at the endless sands. "I wasn't gonna let you hurt alone." Behind them, the compound burned, flames rising high against the night sky, painting the desert red. And as they disappeared into the darkness, Caleb Rourke knew it wasn't over. Bramley was still alive, and he was coming. The desert was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that hides danger beneath its stillness. Caleb and Lydia rode through the night, the pale moon their only witness. Her arms were wrapped weakly around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. She was alive, bruised, trembling, but alive. Yet Caleb knew that survival alone wouldn't be enough, not while Bramley still drew breath. They stopped at dawn beside a dried riverbed. Caleb built a small fire, his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion and blood loss. Lydia tried to help, but he shook his head. "You need rest more'n I do." She looked at him, eyes red-rimmed but steady. "He won't stop, Caleb. He'll come for you now." Caleb poked the fire, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll finish it before he gets the chance." Lydia swallowed hard. "You can't fight all of them." He met her gaze, his voice low. "I ain't fighting all of them. Just the one that matters." By mid-morning, they reached an abandoned mining shack, a place Caleb remembered from his lawman days. It wasn't much, but it would give them cover. He tended to his wound while Lydia fetched water from a cracked barrel outside. She moved slower now, every step marked by pain, but there was something new in her, a spark that hadn't been there before. When she returned, she found Caleb loading his rifle. "You're going back, aren't you?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. "You'll die," she said, her voice trembling. Caleb looked at her then, and for the first time she saw the truth in his eyes. Not recklessness, but resignation. "Maybe," he said, "but I won't live knowing that man's still breathing after what he's done." Lydia's hands clenched at her sides. "Then I'm going with you." He started to protest, but she cut him off. "You said I don't belong to anyone, not even fear. So don't you dare tell me to hide now." Caleb hesitated, then nodded once. "All right, then. We ride together." That night, the desert wind rose like a whisper of ghosts. The two of them approached Bramley's ranch again, or what was left of it. Much of it had burned, but the main house still stood, its windows glowing with lantern light. Horses were tied out front, and men with rifles patrolled the yard. Caleb and Lydia crept closer, moving through the shadows. Every step brought them closer to the heart of hell. When they reached the porch, Caleb whispered, "Stay behind me." He kicked open the door. The room inside was filled with smoke, whiskey, and hate. Bramley sat at a table, his left arm bound in a sling, a pistol resting by his drink. When he saw Caleb, a slow smile spread across his scarred face. "Well, look what the fire dragged in," Bramley drawled. "You just don't know when to stay buried, do ya?" Caleb stepped inside, rifle raised. "You marked her, branded her like cattle. You think that's something a man can forgive?" Bramley chuckled. "Forgive? Ain't asking for forgiveness, Rourke. I'm taking back what's mine." He reached for his gun, but Caleb was faster. The rifle roared, shattering the table and sending Bramley sprawling. The room erupted in chaos. Two guards burst in from the hall. Lydia grabbed one of their dropped pistols and fired. Her shot struck true. The other man turned on her, but Caleb cut him down before he could raise his weapon. Then silence. Only Bramley's ragged breathing broke it. He lay against the wall, clutching his bleeding side. His eyes blazed with hate. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You can't save her. You can't save yourself." Caleb stepped closer, eyes cold as steel. "Ain't about saving. It's about ending." Bramley laughed weakly. "You ain't no better'n me, Rourke." Caleb leveled the rifle. "Difference is, I know it." He pulled the trigger. The sound thundered through the house and out into the desert night. When the smoke cleared, Lydia stood beside him, staring at Bramley's lifeless body. She didn't speak, didn't cry. Instead, she just whispered, "It's over." Caleb nodded slowly. For him, maybe. They walked out together into the cool night air. The wind carried away the last of the smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Caleb's shoulder bled again, and Lydia reached up to steady him. "Let's go home," she said softly. He looked toward the horizon, the long stretch of dark land waiting to be rebuilt, and nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "Let's go home." Behind them, Bramley's house burned, the flames rising, high like a final judgment, lighting the desert in shades of vengeance and release. And for the first time in years, Caleb Rourke felt something close to peace. Not because the killing was over, but because justice finally was. The fire that consumed Bramley's house burned until dawn, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. By the time the last embers died, the desert was quiet again. Eerily quiet, like the land itself was holding its breath after witnessing what had happened. Caleb and Lydia stood a mile away, watching the smoke rise into the pale morning light. Neither spoke for a long time. Lydia's dress was torn, her face streaked with soot, but her eyes were clear. For the first time since Caleb had found her by the creek, she wasn't trembling. She looked at the flames and whispered, "It's strange. I thought when he died I'd feel free." but all I feel is tired." Caleb nodded, leaning heavily on his rifle. His shoulder throbbed, but he said nothing. "Freedom don't come easy," he said quietly. "Sometimes it don't even feel like freedom when you get it. Just emptiness, till you figure out what to fill it with." Lydia looked at him then. Really looked. And for the first time, she didn't see a stranger or a savior. She saw a man worn thin by loss, carrying the same kind of ghosts she did. "Then maybe we can figure it out together," she said softly. They left the desert behind as the sun climbed higher, its warmth spilling across the plains. By the time they reached what was left of the Rourke Ranch, the air smelled of wet ash and new grass. The barn was gone, nothing but black timbers and dust, but the house still stood, scorched, wounded but standing. Martha came running from the porch the moment she saw them. She cried out Lydia's name, pulling her into a trembling hug. Then she turned to Caleb, her eyes filling with tears. "Lord above, you look like death chewed you up and spat you out." Caleb smiled weakly. "Feels about right." Martha fussed over his shoulder wound while Lydia fetched water. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house filled with sounds of life again. The clatter of dishes, the crackle of a small fire, the faint hum of Martha's voice as she worked. Later, Caleb sat on the porch, watching the horizon as the sun began to set. The sky turned soft and pink, and the smell of rain drifted in on the wind. Lydia joined him, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in her hands. She sat beside him quietly, their shoulders barely touching. "Never thought I'd see peace again," he murmured. "You gave it back to me," Lydia said, "even when I didn't think I deserved it." Caleb turned his head, meeting her gaze. "You were owed peace long before you met me. You just had to take it." She smiled faintly, a real smile this time, fragile but warm. "And what about you? You gonna keep hiding out here forever?" He looked out across the burned fields, his land, scarred but still alive. "Ain't hiding," he said. "Just rebuilding. This place still got roots. I reckon I do too." They sat in silence after that, watching the stars appear one by one. Somewhere out in the desert, a lone coyote howled, and Lydia shivered. Caleb shifted closer, draping his coat over her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded. "Ain't no need. Just glad you're here to see the morning." Weeks passed. Together they rebuilt what they could. Lydia learned to mend fences, tend the horses that returned, and cook over the old stove. Caleb taught her to read, and in the evenings she read aloud by lamplight while he carved new beams for the barn. The days were hard, but they were honest, and that made them beautiful. One morning, Lydia placed a single wildflower on the windowsill, a desert bloom, bright and stubborn. When Caleb asked what it was for, she said, "To remember that life grows back, even here." He smiled, resting a hand over hers. "Even here," he echoed. The wind swept through the open fields, carrying away the last of the smoke, the last of the fear. The land was quiet again. But this time, it was the kind of quiet that felt like peace, not mourning. As the sun rose high over the plains, Lydia turned to Caleb and said, "It hurts less now." He looked at her with tired, gentle eyes. "That's how you know you're healing." And together, under the endless Arizona sky, they stepped forward. 2 souls battered by darkness, walking side by side into a new dawn.